Welcome to Power Talk. I'm Kamal Franklin. To my left is Andre Moore, and sitting in again for Neil Nelson is Tracy Donnelly. Take it away, Tracy.
Thank you again, Kamal. Our topic today is false black power and why political black leaders have not led to black progress. Sorry. Um, Unluckily for President Obama, he became the first black president of the United States, right? So it's a legacy that he now has to carry, whether or not he thinks that was the position that he wanted to be in. He was considered for many the black savior, the black messiah, the one who was going to finally come and save black people from their oppression. For others, he was considered just a symbol of his presence there was enough for black progress and black excellence. So before we even get into the topic, I want to ask you guys, is Obama above reproach?
I think within the black community, there's obviously a high portion of the population that supports President Obama, former President Obama, no matter what. He's probably in a sort of can do no wrong category, and the symbolism outweighs any specific acts that he has accomplished while he was the president. So I think that's something that our community, because he was the first, because he's had such a beautiful family, smart, intelligent, and the rest. I think because of our status here, we carry that pretty high as a community. But it doesn't mean that his policies should not be critiqued. It should not be understood within the larger context of what being president of the United States means. And this should be a fun debate around whether or not we think Obama actually accomplished something during the time he was president, particularly for black people
Right, him and other black politicians.
and other black politicians. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think President Obama should be beyond reproach. I think that no black leader, no black author, we shouldn't view any person in the black community as a messiah. I think that we should hold everyone accountable to what our community needs. And so, therefore, the whole idea of not criticizing someone because they hold a certain position, I don't think that that's in our interest at all.
Got it. So Jason Riley, a conservative writer who penned a 2014 book called Please Stop Helping Us: How Liberals Make It Harder for Blacks to Succeed, recently released an excerpt of his new book called False Black Power. In the excerpt, he essentially states that black people should have better managed their expectations of what Obama could have done for them. Because for decades, other black politicians have been elected in various positions and have still not moved the needle of progress for black people. So is he right? What are some of the reasons why black politicians have been unable, including Obama, to really help black people progress in America for decades, while simultaneously somehow being able to help other special interest groups?
Well, if I start with that question, I would think the only thing that the author got right is a general critique on whether or not the black president really meant certain sort of like far off progress for black people. Incremental progress, I think there has been, obviously. I don't think we can sit here and act like black leadership throughout the decades and black people have not strived and achieved progress within the context of living within the United States. However, there's different ways to measure that, right? There's different ways to suggest whether or not progress means liberation or freedom, whether or not that means our rights are fully protected, whether or not that means that this current path that we're on is actually going to mean something for our children and our children's sake in terms of having the quality of life that we want them to have. So I think there's a lot of things that are left open. However, I think fundamentally the author is wrong in suggesting somehow that liberals are the cause of black angst and or disappointment and or lack of progress, and that somehow conservative folks like himself have the answers and solutions to how black people should be living our lives in terms of what progress we can get.
Well, so I agree that conservatives may not be the answer, are not the answer. But don't you think liberals have caused some problems in the black community, have held black people back somewhat?
Yeah, I think the great disdain for liberals for me is that they go so far and then they won't jump. right? So basically, liberals will tell you all the things that's wrong with America. They'll agree with you there, but their only solution is gradualism. And the moment you start to really challenge the orthodoxy of America, they pull back. So liberals are the type who, unfortunately, will walk with you so far, but then push you out front and run back behind, because ultimately they're linked with the conservative establishment. However, before I let you jump in, that does not mean that the ideas of having an open society, a society where governments offer to make sure that their citizenry is taken care of, that taxes are progressive, that there's fairness in terms of how things are regulated, and making sure laws protect both minority populations and make sure the majorities don't carry an overt amount of power. I think those are good things for any society to try to strive for. I just think that liberals, again, don't really believe in their rhetoric when it comes to black people. However, conservatives don't care about black people whatsoever, and their arguments are patently false. I'm gonna
Right.
stop
So I
filibustering.
think Jason Riley is absolutely spot on when he identifies that liberals have been an anchor for the black community. And one reason why the black people have not risen. But I also think he's spot on in saying that black leadership, political leadership, the rise in that has not corresponded with any meaningful progress for black people. I think he does acknowledge that there has been social progress, right, to some degree, but things that move the needle in the direction of improving the way that improving the way that black people compete with other people in the country has not. And so let me identify some of the statistics that he shared that I
Please do.
think identifies that, shows that. So in the Deep South, black office holders grew from 100 in 1964 to 4,300 in 1978, right? And by the early 1980s, major U.S. cities with large black populations, such as Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Washington, Philadelphia, had elected black mayors. And between 1970 and 2010, the number of black elected officials nationwide increased from 1,500 to 10,000, right? Yet, the socioeconomic progress that was supposed to follow in the wake of these political gains never materialized. So blacks are still, since 1970, have a third of the economic wealth, I think, that white folks have. And on top of that, in all really socioeconomic markers, there's been very little progress. It's been very stagnant since the civil
Right.
rights movement. And so therefore that shows that black political leadership does not correspond with black progress.
Right. So I'm going to interject here. I don't want to make it a liberal versus conservative debate. I want us to hold black political leaders specifically responsible. Do they hold a special responsibility to black people when they are elected? And going back to the question, why have they not done more? Why have we not made more gains economically with the rise that Dre just pointed out that we have seen in elected black political leaders? Why haven't we made any
I would like to jump in and just say, because
progress?
fundamentally, that's just not the way that things work. If you look at who's making socioeconomic political changes at the top, it's not the politicians. Politicians, no matter what their race or creed is, are beholden to someone else. And I think that they're beholden to people, the economic interests, the captains of industry. And because we do not have that in our community, we cannot hold black political leaders accountable for what they do for our communities. And therefore, even though they're there, they are beholden to the same captains of industry and who do not fundamentally care about the black community.
Well, here's where I think the rhetoric against liberals is extremely correct.
Back to liberals.
Well, you mentioned them in your in-between comments. So I do think that black politicians buy into the liberal argument that they could be anything they want to be in America. And based on that argument, they begin to separate themselves, at least they have over the last 20 or 30 years, from the larger black community. So the black community is now just a launching pad to political careers as opposed to a place where folks who are elected to office feel they are beholden to the interests of the larger black community. And so we have people who now, Cory Booker types, Obama types, who raise to a certain political level. They may placate things in the black community, but they don't see their careers as dependent on what happens within the black community. And I think that's fundamentally something that's shifted from the 60s and 70s in terms of black politicians who, for the most part, were elected based on a strong analysis of their connection to the community and the power they were supposed to help bring to communities, particularly at a mayorship. We have some exceptions of that today, of course, but the vast majority of black political forces, I think, really don't connect their individual political interests to what happens in the larger community. And I think that's something that is more or less a response to or responsive to the sort of liberal tendency to believe in a quote unquote colorblind society, particularly for those of middle class and upper middle class who can make more let's say progress in society because they don't have to feel like they're connected to the ills or the ilks of the larger community, the pains and sufferings that people may be feeling. They feel that they can go out and they can just do anything because they have more wealth, more capital, more access. And I think that's a change that's happened since the civil rights / black power movement.
But isn't that been ever since the onslaught, the civil rights movement and this explosion of black people holding office? Because if you think about the political process, how do you even become a viable candidate for office? You have to raise money. And so who are giving these candidates money? So from the very beginning, they are beholden to someone else outside of the black community because they're not getting that money from the black community. So I think that the whole process shows that without having economic power of significance, then there is no way that a political leadership can be useful for you. And I'm arguing that with economic power, not to say that by itself it should be our only pathway, but it being the primary focus, it will give us far more gains in probably 10 years than would the 100 years of blacks pursuing political office.
Well, that's a conservative argument. That's a Booker T. Washington approach, right, to politics.
And we abandoned Booker T. Washington for Du Bois' argument, and I'm saying that over that course of time, we've seen very little. We've seen some social progress.
We've seen social progress. We've seen some economic progress.
In terms of the same class that is vying for political influence in the United States have gotten richer, but poor black people have gotten poorer.
Well, here's the problem.
I got some more statistics.
Wait a minute before you do that. Let me just. Here's the problem with the conservative approach, particularly historically speaking. They say things, and Jason Riley is one of these folks. We did better in the 40s and 50s and early 60s, maybe, or 30s, 40s, 50s, than we did presently. What they don't mention is those were mostly democratic, liberal federal governments that we were operating under during that time period. Then when these periods supposedly we are doing worse under, for the most part, those federal offices in terms of the presidency have been held by right-wing Republicans. Why would we ever trust an argument made by right-wing Republicans who have never shown any real interest in supporting and helping the black community? Anytime we bring up anything that we suffer around white supremacy, racism, the challenges of living in this society, we are always told by that community, that conservative community, and their black political friends that we are crying. We're not talking about things happening in our own community. They speak about our pathology in the black community, and they never want to talk about white racism, white supremacy, the historical and current day conditions which limit black progress. So anytime you deal with a group of people who tell you to don't blame us, even though we control all the mechanisms of power, instead look inward as if that's the only solution, then I think we have a problem when we start to use them as the sort of the guide to black progress.
Right, so I'm not using them as a guide. I don't see them as a guide. So I agree with you, as I stated
before.
You
sure you do?
That the black conservatives have no genuine interest. I think that they primarily play a role in which they are defending white interest. They believe that black interests are tied or should be tethered to white interest, and they would like to assuage whites' feelings of guilt for how white folks have traditionally treated black folks in this community. I mean, in this country. However, sometimes your biggest hater gives you the most honest criticism. And so in terms of their criticism on black culture, I think that black people do have to acknowledge that our culture, broken from slavery, that also holds us back, right? And primarily, our oppression is a relationship between, or as Jelani has said before on this program, it's a power deficit. That's a relationship that we have with white folks where we, to some degree, accept them dominating us. And our culture, that has been built into the DNA of our current culture. And so there has to be a change in culture in order for us to see the world differently, see how we should behave differently. And so therefore, I think that our biggest haters, black conservatives, gives us a good criticism on that there needs to be a change in black culture. Now, I don't agree with their premise that white supremacy doesn't exist or it's a minor effect that we shouldn't pay that much attention to. But white supremacy is a symptom of a larger problem, and yet black culture is also a symptom of that same problem, and both of those have to be addressed in order for us to come to an appropriate solution.
Right. So I don't think that, at least from what I've read on Riley, that he is equating our experience and saying that, we can do what whites have done and, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. But he did mention that we can look at other minority groups who were immigrants into this country who gained power. And he noted that while we cannot compare their experience as ours, it's not apples to apples. However, there are lessons that we can glean from what they did, namely the Germans, Asians, the Jews. So I'm wondering, do we have to abandon the need for political power, for economic power, or can we have a two-pronged approach to gaining power overall?
Well, I'm for a two-pronged approach. I think economic power, black political power, social power, I think all those things matter.
Which should lead then?
I think creating institutions that have economic power is extremely important in this particular time frame that we are in as a people. I don't think the political process as it's built works to get us liberation. And the things that will get us liberation are the things that we control as a people. And I think once we control certain institutions, it allows us to control certain policies and politics. So I do think, yes, at this particular stage, we have to create institutions that give us enough power to make sure that that power is brought out into the world, let's say. I think simply relying on elected officials within this current system does not bring us the kind of power that we need, and instead has us going back and forth, sort of like in a death spiral around what policies are going to get us free, and then those policies change in 5 years, they change in 10 years. But that's not to say that political power is not important. I would never agree that those who don't hold any of my interests at heart somehow now have good advice to give me. That their advice should always be taken with a grain of salt, because if they're offering it, it's not good for me. I don't think Riley, who is friends with O'Reilly, who's a commentator on Fox, works for the Wall Street Journal, works for the Manhattan Think Tank Institute, has any interest whatsoever in the advancement of black people. What he does have an interest in is protecting his white benefactors from getting any kind of harsh critique from black folks and or white allies, for that matter, in terms of their policies and how they affect black folks.
Well, I think that that black folks who hold on to the same traditions and cultures that has failed us for over 100 years are also black conservatives and are also threatening to the black community. And so one thing I would say is towards other groups is I think that there are principles, and it's not just in America or the history of American immigration. If you look across the world, there has been this thing in the Caribbean and Africa where black folks have focused on political power. And it just seems that the individuals who are able to rise up in that paradigm tend to be the individuals that are most likely to sell out black folks. Mm-hmm. And so I think that while I don't see it as political power being, that we should cede political power and say, we don't care at all about it, I think that our focus needs to move more to economic power. And I think that that's a prerequisite to true political power. And so therefore, even if we were to lose political power while we focused on economic power, I think that we would make a lot more progress.
Well, let me just say that I totally disagree with your assessment that we've failed over the last 100 years as black people and black leadership.
Oh, I
We've
didn't say
made,
black people failed over the
you
last.
said over the last
I
100
said
years
that
we
black
failed.
the methods and the cultural norms that has failed us.
Well, no, you're saying that now, but that's not what you
No, no,
said a few
no. I
seconds.
said the
That's what you
culture.
meant to say?
Yeah, I said the cultures and the traditions that have failed us over the last 100 years.
I don't think our culture has actually failed us over. I'll go there. I'll move my bar with your bar.
Okay.
I don't think our culture has failed us over the last 100 years. I think it's been a black culture of resistance, resiliency, organizing, including economic, political, social, which has moved us from slavery, from Jim Crow, to a place where we have the opportunities to do things that we didn't have before. And it's really a question of whether or not we see those opportunities and will take advantage of them, not to become part of the larger system of American capitalism, but to find our ways to escape it, to find our ways, as you've talked about, to create these institutions that allow us the freedom to build, knowing that there are going to be people out there like Riley who don't have our interests, and how do we get to defend our interests against those kind of folks?
But wouldn't it require a fundamental cultural shift to
Exactly.
even view to have that idea that we're going of the kind of power that we need to seize? Wouldn't that require?
Yes,
So
'cause-
those same traditions of what they call social agitation, making noise in other people's country, when we don't have to do that. I think that and as I think the black conservative O'Reilly points out, that other groups making less noise has been able to make a lot more progress than we have, based on the fact of what economic kind of power is. So political power is power. I don't want to come off as if that's like absolutely no power, but economic power is a far more powerful force.
Yes, I would say that Marcus Garvey and the UNIA movement serves as the best example that we've had as the most successful economic movement that he didn't really seek, and the movement didn't really seek political power, or at least not outward from the organization. So how do we get back to that place where we can recreate something like what Garvey did?
Right. I think it requires, like I said, a fundamental cultural shift in how we view what our role in the country is, how we view each other, how we relate to each other. And I think that that's what we need to focus on. I think that how we relate to white folks in terms of political and social, economic, that being our focus, us trying to figure out how to get along, how to integrate, that those things are distractions from what's larger. And that's how are you able to punish and reward people who work or work against the interests of black folks?
I think there's truth in some of that, but I think Garvey also made mistakes. I think partly, I know that's shocking, but I think potentially not seeking more political support or gaining more political support could have been a protectorate for Garvey during that time period, as opposed to just thinking having economic support alone would be something that protected him against larger capital white interests, conservative and liberal interests at the time, who wanted to stop him, and even black liberals or black integrationist forces that wanted to stop him. So I just think that yes, there's things that we don't have that we really need to focus on more of, because we don't have them, or we have them in such small quantities that they really don't do anything to help forward or advance our movement. But at the same time, we can't act like by doing that we can't take care of some other things also, because I think those things matter importantly in terms of how we shape the black political body. And so even though I think there needs to be some cultural shifts, in particularly in terms, I will say, ideologically speaking, about how we view our relationship to America. I don't think necessarily, again, I'm not going to go as far as to suggest that black culture has either A, failed us, and or B, has put us in such a dire position in and of itself that that's what stops us from progressing. I think the thing that stops us when we are met with oppositional force that is more powerful than we are, that has stopped both liberal advocates of black success, i.e. a Dr. King, to more nationalist forces, i.e. a Garvey and or Malcolm X. So it doesn't matter what spectrum you're on in terms of what you plead to be your interests or moving forward. You have powerful oppositional forces that if they see those things as something that's going to somehow interfere with their right to wield power, then they're going to come and squash it. So
Right.
we have to be
I
prepared for
agree
all of
with
it.
that, but I think, as I was stating before, that our current cultural configuration does not have an answer for that yet. How do we answer other groups with greater forces? And I think that one, we don't have a culture of organization, which I
Right.
think fundamentally what power comes out of.
Yeah. On the culture piece, as I believe I mentioned yesterday, that we have a culture of resilience that you reaffirmed. When do we move to the place where we're thinking about thriving and protecting ourselves and not necessarily patting ourselves on the back that we've made it this far? When do we get
That we've
to the place?
survived.
Right, yes. So we have survived. When do we begin to thrive?
Well, I think those things happen symmetrically. They happen at the same time. I don't. There's not a stop-start measure for you finish surviving, then you hit strive mode or whatever. People will be at different places. I think it's up to folks who believe in organizational power, particularly economic power, to build those institutions now that begin to show the rest of us, right, what it is that we can do that makes other folks say, I think we can do that, or we can do that again as we once did before. I think that's up to all of us to do, particularly those of us who believe in building this kind of power mechanisms that are outside the constraints of both liberal and conservative forces. Because conservatives don't really want black power, right?
No.
Conservatives want you to integrate at a low level and be satisfied and shut up. That's what they really want us to do, is to be happy with whatever we have, but not to blame white folks for whatever we don't have. That's
Right.
that's their bigger goal or interest. So I think that we change our culture every day as we act, and I think as soon as we begin to build these alternative institutions, particularly those of us with some of these ideas, then that is when the larger community, as it's always has, starts to come around and say, hey, that's an idea that maybe we've explored in the past, but now I see it in a different light. And now we're getting away from just sort of rhetorical statements. And I think that's part of the larger movement issue that folks are sort of burnt out on, right? But when they see sort of things happening and they see motion, then they join it. And again, we can critique whether or not it's always good for folks to join what they see, but I think that's a starting point.
Right, but don't you think that those greater forces, that part of their strategy is to give legs to liberal movements or black liberals who take a more you know wait, let there be a slower well, let's wait for things to change. It takes time, more
I think
social
within the
agitation.
ruling,
Those kind of perspectives tend to take legs in the black community. But cultural shift, that's something different, and people are sensitive around culture because I don't think that white folks necessarily have an issue with integrating black folks into the larger American scheme as long as black folks are willing to stop being black to some degree, right? And so therefore I think that when you're talking about cultural shifts and cultural change, is that's the fundamental problem, because you need to see yourself have an identity construct that benefits the United States or benefits white supremacy in general. And so I think that that's part of the way that the government tries to thwart those movements, is to say, oh, this Negro has an idea that we can leverage to keep black people in check.
well, again, I don't think it's that sort of conspiratorial where white folks are saying, let's have black people follow the liberal point of view because we think that's failure. I think when you have conservative elements in government, they want you to follow a conservative point of view because they think that will keep us in check. And I think liberals, for their own reasons, some of them I think are sincere and that they really believe in America and they believe that over time America will open up and be the land of opportunity and milk and honey. And I think as these are the two strongest forces within the American body politic, and black folks are looking at sort of weak nationalist forces or weak economic, build economic institution forces, and the only thing they see within the black community that has some legs are those that join with more liberal forces. I think it's a correct analysis, let's say, for the larger black populace to say, you know what, I don't see you building these economic things that we're talking about, or I just see folks standing up and talking and selling me pictures or whatever it is, but I don't see those apparatuses. And so until I do, This person over here, this liberal person, these liberal folks are talking about opening up the government so that I can get a job, so that I can go to school, so that I can feed my children, so that I can participate in a larger economy. Well, of course it makes sense. So that's where people are going to go, right? So I don't think it's, relatively speaking, an issue of the
So
larger
isn't that
mass
a
budget.
more dangerous weapon towards the black community? Because if that open society is happening extremely slow or not happening at all, but the vast majority of us is moving in that direction, and
No,
but
the
we're,
more
we're lulled to
dangerous,
sleep. We're lulled to sleep.
the more dangerous element is the
by
conservative element, which really just wants to lock us up, throw us in prison, contain us with no minimum wage, offer no health care, and basically have us be plantation for the most part, for the rest of our lives, be plantation slaves for the most part. That's their view.
But,
And
but
I don't
isn't
think
that,
that's somehow
isn't that
better
a
for
clearer
us.
enemy than someone that wants you to be psychologically that way?
Well, I think it's like what you said. It's what's our mindset towards both liberal and conservative dynamics. We
So
should know
we
what's at
we
play.
should, yeah, that's what I was saying. So we know as a community that the conservative is an enemy against our progress, but I think that where what I'm arguing is that the liberal is a sneakier method.
I only
As I
argue-
say against dominate us politely, nicely.
I only
dominate
argue
us.
that until we get our forces together, for the larger black population, the liberal sense seems the right path to make, because they don't see those of us who are arguing for a third alternative making enough strides for them to say we're going to leave that and go here. So it's incumbent upon us who have these other ideas to build it so they will come.
Okay, so well, we end in disagreement. I think
You're
that,
not the host. You can't.
I was like, okay, thanks. But yes, thank you guys. This could definitely go on for hours. Certainly a conversation that is not finished. But thank you for your thoughts, and we'll see you guys again tomorrow.